Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going to the Nile Delta, to the marshy river mouths where Egypt meets the Mediterranean, to witness one of the most consequential battles most people have never heard of. A battle that did not simply determine the fate of a single kingdom or a single dynasty, but that may have determined whether an entire civilization would survive at all, at a moment when nearly every other major power in the ancient world was being systematically erased from the historical record within the span of a single human generation. And before we begin, let me tell you 3 things that will stay with you through this entire story. First, in the decades immediately before this battle took place, an entire interconnected world of Bronze Age civilizations collapsed with a speed and a completeness that modern archaeologists still find genuinely difficult to fully explain. The Hittite Empire, the very same formidable power that had fought Ramesses II to a bloody standstill at Kadesh less than a century earlier, simply ceased to exist. Their capital city was burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the legendary heroes who supposedly besieged Troy, collapsed into what archaeologists call a dark age that would last for centuries. City after city across Cyprus, the Levant, and Anatolia was destroyed, many of them never rebuilt at all. And in the middle of this cascading civilizational catastrophe, a loosely connected coalition of seafaring raiders, a group so mysterious that we still do not know with certainty where most of them originally came from, appeared at Egypt's border, not once but twice within a single generation, apparently intending to do to Egypt exactly what had already been done to everyone else. Second, Egypt survived. Egypt is, in fact, the only major Bronze Age power in the entire Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world to survive this collapse as a continuous, recognizable civilization, and the specific battle we are going to examine tonight, fought in the Nile Delta in approximately 1175 BCE under the pharaoh Ramesses III, is one of the primary reasons why. The pharaoh who won this battle did not simply repel an invasion. He may have single-handedly prevented Egypt from becoming another entry on the long list of vanished Bronze Age civilizations, a list that by this point already included some of the most powerful kingdoms the ancient world had ever produced. Third, we still do not fully know who the Sea Peoples actually were. This is one of the most genuinely persistent mysteries in ancient history, and it deserves to be treated as exactly that rather than as a solved problem with a tidy answer. The Egyptian records themselves list several distinct named groups, and modern scholars have spent well over a century attempting to connect these names to specific known peoples and places, with theories ranging from displaced Mycenaean Greeks to peoples from Sardinia, Sicily, and the Western Mediterranean, to groups from Anatolia and the Aegean Islands. Some of these connections are reasonably well supported by the evidence. Others remain genuinely speculative. Understanding this battle means understanding not a simple story of Egypt against a known enemy, but Egypt against a genuinely confusing, multi-ethnic coalition of desperate, displaced peoples whose own origins remain, even today, an active subject of scholarly debate. So go ahead and get comfortable. Lights down. Blanket up. This one is slow and calm and going nowhere fast. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every night, new story. Same pace. Lights always low. Let's begin. To understand the Battle of the Delta, and to understand why it mattered so enormously to the survival of Egyptian civilization, we first need to understand the genuinely strange and disturbing period that preceded it, a period that modern historians and archaeologists refer to as the Late Bronze Age collapse. one of the most dramatic and most puzzling civilizational catastrophes in the entire span of recorded human history. For roughly 3 centuries before this collapse began, the Eastern Mediterranean and the wider Near East had existed as a genuinely interconnected international system, a network of major and minor kingdoms bound together through diplomacy, royal marriages, extensive trade, and, when necessary, warfare, but a system that had nonetheless produced sustained periods of remarkable prosperity and cultural sophistication. Egypt, under its new kingdom pharaohs, was one pillar of this system. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, was another. The Mycenaean palace civilization of mainland Greece, with its heavily fortified citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, was a third. Smaller but genuinely significant kingdoms flourished throughout Cyprus, the Levantine coast, and northern Syria, including the wealthy trading city of Ugarit, whose extensive archives have provided modern historians with an extraordinarily detailed window into the diplomatic and commercial life of this vanished world. This entire interconnected system remarkably began to unravel within the span of just a few decades in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, and the sheer speed and totality of this collapse remains one of the most actively studied and actively debated phenomena in all of ancient history. Cities across the region were destroyed, in many cases violently and suddenly, based on the archaeological evidence of burn layers and abandoned material culture found at sites throughout the region. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned and burned. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed one after another, and the sophisticated bureaucratic writing system the Mycenaeans had used, a script called Linear B, simply vanished along with the literate palace administrations that had employed it, not to be replaced by any comparable writing system in Greece for several centuries. The wealthy trading city of Ugarit was destroyed so suddenly and so completely that archaeologists have found clay tablets in its ruins, still unbaked and in the process of being written, describing desperate final pleas for military assistance against approaching enemy ships. Tablets that were apparently never actually sent because the city fell before they could be dispatched. The causes of this cascading collapse remain genuinely debated among modern scholars, and responsible historians resist the temptation to offer any single, tidy explanation for what was very likely a complex combination of interacting factors. Climate scientists studying ancient pollen records and other environmental evidence have identified indications of significant regional drought and climate disruption during this exact period, potentially undermining agricultural production across a wide area and creating the kind of food insecurity that can drive both internal unrest and external migration pressure. Some historians point to internal political instability within several of the major kingdoms, weakening their capacity to respond effectively to external threats. Others emphasize the sheer interconnectedness of this Bronze Age trading system itself as a vulnerability, since a network of kingdoms so heavily dependent on long-distance trade for critical resources, including the tin needed to produce bronze weapons and tools, may have been particularly vulnerable to cascading disruption once any single major node in that trading network failed. And running through nearly every contemporary account of this period, including Egyptian, Hittite, and Ugaritic sources, is the recurring theme of displaced, seaborne raiders and migrants, groups of people on the move, sometimes attacking by sea, sometimes apparently accompanied by their own families and household goods, suggesting genuine population displacement rather than simple military raiding, appearing again and again at the edges of the collapsing Bronze Age world. The Egyptians, in their own surviving records, refer to these groups collectively using a term that modern scholars translate as the Sea Peoples, though it is important to understand that this was never a single unified nation or ethnic group in any coherent sense, but rather a loose and shifting coalition of different peoples, sometimes cooperating with each other and sometimes not, united primarily by their shared status as displaced, seaborne groups searching for new territory to settle. During a period of genuine widespread civilizational catastrophe. Egypt's first warning. Egypt's own direct confrontation with these sea peoples did not begin with the Great Delta battle we are focusing on tonight. It began roughly a generation earlier, during the reign of the pharaoh Merneptah, son and successor of the great Ramesses II, whose dramatic near-disaster at Kadesh we explored previously. And understanding this earlier encounter helps considerably in understanding why Ramesses III took the threat so seriously when it returned with even greater force decades later. In approximately 1207 BCE, during the 5th year of his reign, Merneptah faced a major invasion of Egypt's western frontier, an attack launched not directly by the Sea Peoples acting alone, but by an alliance between the Libyan peoples to Egypt's west and a coalition of Sea Peoples groups who had apparently allied themselves with this Libyan invasion force. Merneptah's own inscriptions, most notably the famous stela now known as the Merneptah stele, currently held in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, provide our earliest surviving Egyptian textual reference to several of the specific named groups that would later feature prominently in the much larger conflict under Ramesses III. The Merneptah stele lists among this invading coalition peoples identified as the Aquesh, the Teresh, the Luka, the Shurden, and the Shikalesh, names that modern scholars have spent well over a century attempting to connect with specific known historical or archaeological groups, with varying degrees of confidence and consensus. The Shurden in particular are of considerable interest to historians, since this specific group appears not only as invaders during this period but also, somewhat remarkably, as mercenary soldiers actually serving within Egypt's own military forces during roughly this same broader era, suggesting a genuinely complex relationship between Egypt and these seaborne peoples that involved both conflict and, at times, apparent cooperation or employment. Merneptah's forces, according to his own inscriptions, achieved a significant victory against this combined Libyan and Sea Peoples invasion force, and the stele describing this victory is historically significant for an entirely separate reason as well, since it contains the earliest known Egyptian textual reference to a people called Israel, mentioned among a list of defeated enemies in Canaan, making this single inscription one of the most historically important surviving documents for understanding the earliest history of ancient Israel, quite apart from its significance for understanding the Sea Peoples phenomenon itself. This earlier conflict under Merneptah should have served as a clear warning to Egypt regarding the genuine and growing danger these displaced seaborne peoples represented. And to some degree it evidently did influence subsequent Egyptian military planning and border defense. But the scale of what would arrive at Egypt's borders roughly 3 decades later, during the reign of Ramesses III, would prove to be an entirely different and far more existentially dangerous proposition, arriving precisely at the moment when the broader Bronze Age collapse had reached its most catastrophic and most destructive peak throughout the wider region. The world falls apart around Egypt. Let's spend some time now understanding exactly what Ramesses III and his advisors would have known, or at least would have gradually learned, about the collapsing world beyond Egypt's own borders in the years and months leading up to the Great Delta invasion, because this broader context is essential to understanding both the genuine scale of the threat Egypt faced and the remarkable nature of Egypt's eventual survival. By the time Ramesses III came to the Egyptian throne, in approximately 1186 BCE, the Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and eventual peace partner following the events at Kadesh, had either already collapsed entirely or was in the final, terminal stages of collapse. The extensive diplomatic correspondence that had once flowed between the Egyptian and Hittite royal courts, the kind of correspondence we examined in our previous story regarding the peace treaty that followed Kadesh, simply ceases within the surviving archaeological and textual record, an absence that itself speaks volumes about the disappearance of a functioning Hittite state capable of maintaining this kind of sustained diplomatic relationship. The wealthy trading city of Ugarit, situated on the Syrian coast and one of Egypt's important trading partners and sources of intelligence regarding conditions further north, was destroyed during this same general period, its final surviving administrative correspondence describing exactly the kind of desperate, unanswered pleas for military assistance against approaching enemy ships that we mentioned earlier. Egyptian merchants and diplomatic contacts operating throughout the Levantine coast during this period would very likely have witnessed, or at minimum heard detailed and increasingly alarming reports regarding, the systematic destruction of city after city throughout this region, a pattern of cascading collapse that must have been genuinely terrifying to observe from the relative safety of the Egyptian court, knowing that Egypt itself shared extensive coastal and land borders with exactly the same troubled region. Cyprus, another important node in the Eastern Mediterranean trading network and another source of both trade goods and strategic intelligence for Egypt, experienced significant destruction and disruption during this same period, with several major settlements showing clear archaeological evidence of violent destruction dating to approximately this era. The specific relationship between Cyprus and the Sea Peoples phenomenon remains debated among archaeologists, with some evidence suggesting Cyprus may have served as a staging area or temporary settlement point for some Sea Peoples groups during their broader movement toward Egypt. Given this genuinely catastrophic regional context, the arrival of Sea Peoples forces at Egypt's own borders during the reign of Ramesses III would not have come as any kind of complete surprise to the Egyptian court. Egyptian intelligence networks, diplomatic contacts, and simple refugee reports from the collapsing kingdoms to the north would very likely have provided at least some meaningful advance warning that this same destructive pattern was steadily approaching Egypt's own frontiers, even if the precise timing, scale, and specific composition of the eventual invasion force remained genuinely uncertain until the actual crisis unfolded. Ramesses III and Egypt's military preparations. Let's turn our attention now to Ramesses III himself, the pharaoh whose reign would be defined above all else by his successful defense of Egypt against this existential threat, and to the specific military and administrative preparations that allowed Egypt to survive when so many of its neighbors had already fallen. Ramesses III came to the Egyptian throne at what was, by any reasonable historical assessment, a genuinely difficult and dangerous moment. He was the founding pharaoh of Egypt's 20th dynasty, ascending to power following a period of some internal political instability that had affected Egypt during the final years of the preceding 19th dynasty, the same dynasty that had included both Seti I and Ramesses II. This internal instability meant that Ramesses III inherited not simply an external strategic crisis, but also the ongoing task of consolidating and stabilizing Egypt's internal governance at precisely the moment when external threats were reaching their most dangerous and most existential peak. Ramesses III appears to have modeled himself deliberately and self-consciously on his great predecessor Ramesses II, adopting similar royal titles, commissioning monuments in similar architectural styles, and, most relevantly for our purposes tonight, apparently studying and applying military and administrative lessons drawn from his predecessor's long and largely successful reign. This deliberate emulation extended to Ramesses III's own extensive building program, including his mortuary temple complex at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. a temple whose walls contain by far our most important and most extensive surviving source of information regarding the Sea People's conflict, carved and painted in the same tradition of monumental royal commemoration that Ramesses II had used so extensively to record his own version of the Battle of Kadesh. The Egyptian military that Ramesses III commanded had itself continued to evolve since the era of Ramesses II, incorporating lessons learned from generations of continued conflict and diplomatic engagement throughout the wider region. The chariot-centered warfare that had proven so decisive at Kadesh remained an important component of Egyptian military doctrine, but the specific nature of the Sea People's threat, involving significant naval elements and a genuinely different style of warfare than the traditional chariot-based confrontations between major territorial states, required Egypt to adapt its military preparations accordingly. Critically, and this represents one of the most historically significant aspects of Ramesses III's military preparations, Egyptian intelligence networks appear to have provided sufficient advance warning of the approaching Sea People's coalition to allow for genuinely substantial defensive preparation before the actual invasion arrived, a luxury that many of Egypt's neighbors, based on the archaeological evidence of sudden, apparently unexpected destruction at numerous sites throughout the region, evidently did not enjoy. This advance warning allowed Ramesses III to position both land and naval forces strategically along Egypt's vulnerable eastern and northeastern approaches, preparing defensive positions and mobilizing military resources in a manner that the historical record suggests was considerably more organized and considerably better prepared than the apparently chaotic, overwhelmed defenses that had failed to save so many other kingdoms throughout the wider region. Who were the Sea Peoples? Let's spend considerable time now on the genuinely difficult question of exactly who these Sea Peoples actually were, because this remains one of the most actively debated puzzles in the entire field of ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean archaeology. And any honest account of this history needs to acknowledge both what we do know with reasonable confidence and what remains genuinely uncertain. The Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III, primarily preserved on the walls of his Medinet Habu temple complex, list several specific named groups among the invading coalition, including the Peleset, the Checker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, and the Weshish, in addition to some groups already familiar from the earlier Merneptah inscriptions decades before. Each of these names has generated its own body of scholarly analysis and debate, with varying degrees of confidence regarding their likely historical identification. The Peleset represent perhaps the most confidently identified of these groups, since most scholars connect this name with the Philistines, the people who would go on to settle the coastal region of Canaan that still bears a version of their name today in modern Palestine. Archaeological evidence from Philistine settlement sites in this coastal region, dating to the period immediately following the Sea People's conflicts, shows material culture with genuine connections to the Aegean world, including pottery styles that appear closely related to late Mycenaean traditions, lending considerable support to theories connecting the Peleset with displaced populations originating from the collapsing Mycenaean world of Greece. The Checker are somewhat less confidently identified, but are frequently connected by scholars with a region or people associated with Western Anatolia, possibly connected to the historical Teucrians associated in later Greek tradition with the broader Troy region, though this specific connection remains considerably more speculative than the Peleset-Philistine identification. The Shikalesh and the Shurden, the latter already familiar from the earlier Merneptah conflict, have generated theories connecting them respectively with Sicily and Sardinia, based primarily on the phonetic similarity between these ancient names and the later classical names for these western Mediterranean islands. This particular theory, while genuinely intriguing and while it would suggest a sea peoples phenomenon involving movement across remarkably vast distances of the Mediterranean, remains actively debated among scholars, with some researchers questioning whether this represents genuine historical connection or simply coincidental phonetic similarity between ancient and later place names. The Denyen have been connected by some scholars with the Danans, one of the poetic names used in later Greek epic tradition, including Homer's Iliad, to refer to the Greeks besieging Troy, potentially suggesting yet another connection to the collapsing Mycenaean Greek world, though this identification, like several others, remains a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion rather than settled consensus. What emerges from this admittedly uncertain picture is a portrait of the Sea Peoples not as any single unified nation or coordinated military force, but rather as a genuinely diverse, shifting coalition drawing on displaced populations from across a wide swath of the collapsing Bronze Age Mediterranean and Aegean world, quite possibly including groups from mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands, western Anatolia, Cyprus, and potentially even the central and western Mediterranean united, temporarily by their shared circumstances as displaced peoples seeking new territory during a period of genuine widespread civilizational catastrophe, rather than by any deeper shared ethnic or political identity. The Egyptian inscriptions themselves provide an additional detail of genuine historical significance regarding the nature of this invasion, describing not simply an invading military force but an entire migrating population, including women, children, and household possessions transported in ox carts, suggesting that at least some portion of this Sea Peoples coalition represented genuine population displacement and attempted resettlement rather than simple military raiding. This detail has led some historians to interpret the Sea Peoples phenomenon, at least in part, as a genuine mass migration event driven by the broader collapse of settled agricultural and political life throughout much of the eastern Mediterranean and Aegean world, with these displaced populations seeking new, stable territory in which to resettle, and Egypt, with its reliable Nile floods and its comparatively stable political order even amid the wider regional chaos, representing an obviously attractive target for exactly this kind of desperate resettlement effort. The land invasion begins. Let's now follow the actual unfolding sequence of the Sea Peoples invasion during the reign of Ramesses III, because the Egyptian sources describe what appears to have been a coordinated two-pronged assault, combining both a significant land invasion moving through the Levant toward Egypt's northeastern frontier and a simultaneous naval invasion approaching directly toward the mouths of the Nile itself. The land component of this invasion, according to the Egyptian inscriptions, moved through the Levantine coastal region in a manner that echoed the same pattern of destruction that had already consumed so many cities and kingdoms throughout this same territory in the preceding years. This advancing coalition force appears to have included not merely warriors but, as mentioned, entire displaced populations moving with their families and possessions, suggesting a slow, sustained movement of people through the region rather than a rapid military strike, consistent with the broader interpretation of at least part of this phenomenon as genuine mass population displacement rather than purely military invasion. Ramesses III, according to his own inscriptions, moved to intercept and confront this advancing land force at Egypt's northeastern frontier, in the general border region between Egypt and Canaan that had long served as Egypt's traditional first line of defense against threats approaching from this direction. The same general frontier region that Egyptian armies, including that of Ramesses II, had used as a staging point for their own campaigns northward in earlier generations. The specific details of this land engagement are considerably less thoroughly documented in the surviving Egyptian sources than the subsequent naval battle that would follow, but the inscriptions do claim a significant Egyptian victory, describing considerable enemy casualties and the effective halting of this particular advancing force before it could penetrate deeply into Egyptian territory proper. Egyptian border fortifications, part of a defensive system that had been developed and maintained across multiple preceding reigns specifically to protect this vulnerable frontier approach, likely played a significant role in this successful defensive action, providing Egyptian forces with prepared defensive positions from which to confront the advancing coalition force rather than requiring Egypt to meet this threat in completely open, unprepared terrain. This successful land defense, while genuinely significant in its own right and while it prevented at least one major avenue of invasion from succeeding, was not, however, the primary or the most historically significant confrontation of this broader conflict. That distinction belongs to the dramatic naval engagement that followed, fought in the marshy channels and river mouths of the Nile Delta, an engagement that has come to be known to modern historians simply as the Battle of the Delta, and that represents one of the earliest naval battles in recorded human history for which we possess genuinely detailed, if still one-sided, contemporary documentation. The Battle of the Delta. Let's now spend considerable time on the naval engagement itself, because this battle, fought in approximately 1175 BCE in the 8th year of Ramesses III's reign, represents both a genuinely remarkable moment of military innovation and the decisive engagement that likely determined whether Egypt would survive as an independent civilization or join the long list of Bronze Age kingdoms that had already been destroyed. The Sea People's naval force, according to the Egyptian inscriptions and their accompanying visual depictions carved into the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, approached Egypt via the Mediterranean, apparently intending to sail directly into and up the branching channels of the Nile Delta, using the river's own navigable waterways to penetrate deep into Egyptian territory rather than attempting a more conventional beach landing that would have required subsequent overland movement through potentially well-defended terrain. Ramesses III, having apparently received sufficient advance warning of this approaching naval threat, made a series of genuinely innovative tactical decisions that would prove decisive in the coming engagement. Rather than simply attempting to meet the invading fleet in open water, where Egyptian naval forces, built primarily around vessels designed for Nile River transport and limited coastal operations rather than sustained blue water naval combat, might have faced significant disadvantages against a Sea People's fleet whose crews included experienced Mediterranean seafarers, Ramesses instead chose to draw the invasion force into the confined, shallow channels of the delta itself, terrain that Egyptian forces knew intimately and that could be used to Egypt's considerable tactical advantage. The Egyptian pharaoh positioned his own naval forces at the mouths of the delta's various channels, while simultaneously deploying substantial land-based infantry and archer forces along the riverbanks themselves, creating a combined land and naval defensive position that could bring concentrated firepower to bear against enemy vessels from multiple directions simultaneously. This represents a genuinely sophisticated tactical innovation, essentially using Egypt's own home terrain the invading Sea People's forces would have had comparatively limited familiarity with, as a weapon in itself, transforming what might otherwise have been a straightforward naval engagement into a carefully prepared ambush combining the firepower of both land and water-based forces against an enemy fleet whose maneuverability would be significantly constrained by the narrow, shallow confines of the delta channels. The famous relief carvings at Medinet Habu depicting this battle provide modern historians with an extraordinarily detailed, if obviously one-sided, visual account of how this engagement actually unfolded. Egyptian ships are shown grappling directly with Sea People's vessels, while Egyptian archers positioned both aboard ship and along the riverbanks rain arrows down upon the enemy fleet. The reliefs show Egyptian forces using grappling hooks to seize enemy vessels and capsize them, and depict the chaotic aftermath of the battle, with Sea People's ships shown overturned and sinking, their crews thrown into the water where they faced continued attack from Egyptian forces positioned along the shore. The accompanying inscriptions describe the battle in suitably triumphant terms, characteristic of Egyptian royal commemorative tradition, with Ramesses III presented as personally directing and dominating the engagement through both tactical brilliance and divine favor, echoing the same general pattern of royal self-commemoration we observed in Ramesses II's own account of Kadesh, though in this particular case the accompanying archaeological and broader historical evidence provides considerably stronger independent support for the genuine scale and significance of the Egyptian victory being claimed than was the case regarding the more ambiguous outcome at Kadesh. Unlike the situation following Kadesh, where the Hittites continued to hold Kadesh itself and the two powers eventually settled into a negotiated peace between relative equals, the Sea People's coalition, following its defeat at the Battle of the Delta, appears to have been genuinely and comprehensively broken as a coherent military and migratory force. There is no subsequent evidence of continued large-scale Sea People's military campaigns against Egypt following this engagement, and the broader historical and archaeological pattern suggests that at least some remaining elements of this defeated coalition, rather than continuing their attempted invasion of Egypt, instead redirected their efforts toward settlement in the Levantine coastal regions, most notably in the case of the Peleset, whose settlement in coastal Canaan, as we discussed earlier, likely represents the historical origin of the later Philistine people and their distinctive presence in this region during the subsequent centuries. How Egyptian military technology made the difference. Let's spend some time now examining the specific military technology and tactical innovations that allowed Egyptian forces to achieve this decisive victory, because understanding these specific details helps explain how Egypt succeeded where so many other, comparably sophisticated Bronze Age kingdoms had already failed. The Egyptian composite bow, the same fundamentally sophisticated weapon technology we discussed in detail in our previous exploration of the Battle of Kadesh, played a decisive role in the Delta engagement, allowing Egyptian archers positioned both aboard their own vessels and along the Delta's riverbanks to engage Sea People's ships and their crews at meaningful range before close combat became necessary, inflicting significant casualties and disrupting enemy formations before the two sides ever closed to direct hand-to-hand engagement. The specific tactical decision to fight this battle in the confined waters of the Delta rather than in open sea represents perhaps the single most significant Egyptian innovation in this entire conflict. Sea People's vessels, based on the artistic depictions preserved at Medinet Habu, appear to have been genuinely formidable ships, generally larger than traditional Egyptian rivercraft and evidently well-suited to open-water Mediterranean sailing and raiding operations of exactly the kind that had already devastated so many coastal settlements throughout the wider region. By drawing this fleet into the narrow, shallow, current-affected channels of the Nile Delta, Ramesses effectively neutralized many of these vessels' inherent advantages in open water, while simultaneously allowing Egyptian forces to bring the full weight of prepared land-based defenses to bear against an enemy fleet that had lost much of its normal maneuvering room and tactical flexibility. The reliefs at Medinet Habu also depict Egyptian forces employing grappling equipment to seize and capsize enemy vessels directly, a close combat naval tactic that, combined with the initial disruption caused by sustained archery fire, appears to have proven devastatingly effective against a Sea People's fleet that found itself simultaneously under fire from multiple directions, unable to maneuver freely in the confined delta channels, and increasingly vulnerable to direct boarding and capsizing. Attacks as the battle progressed and Egyptian forces gained the initiative. Beyond these specific tactical and technological factors, Egypt's broader logistical and organizational capacity, the same kind of centralized state apparatus capable of supplying and coordinating large military forces that we examined in detail regarding the Kadesh campaign, allowed Ramesses III to prepare and coordinate this defense in a manner that many of Egypt's less centrally organized or less well-worn neighbors throughout the wider collapsing Bronze Age world had simply been unable to match. The advance warning Egyptian intelligence networks appear to have provided, combined with Egypt's sophisticated administrative capacity to mobilize and position both land and naval forces in advance of the actual invasion, represents a genuinely significant strategic advantage that helps explain why Egypt succeeded in defending itself when so many comparably sophisticated contemporary civilizations had already fallen to this same broader phenomenon of displaced, seaborne raiders and migrants. The cost of survival. Let's take some time now to consider what this prolonged period of external threat and eventual military triumph actually cost Egypt. Because even a successful defense against existential invasion carries significant and lasting consequences for the society that achieves it, consequences that would shape the subsequent trajectory of Egyptian history for generations to come. The sustained military mobilization required to prepare for and ultimately defeat the Sea People's invasion, encompassing both the earlier land engagement at Egypt's northeastern frontier and the decisive naval battle in the Delta, represented a genuinely enormous drain on Egyptian state resources, requiring the mobilization of substantial military forces, the maintenance of prepared defensive positions across multiple fronts, and the diversion of considerable economic resources away from other productive purposes toward sustained military preparedness during a period of genuine existential threat. Egyptian sources from later in Ramesses III's reign, and from the reigns of his successors throughout the remainder of the 20th dynasty, reveal evidence of genuine economic strain within Egyptian society during this broader period, including what appears to be the earliest recorded labor strike in human history, a documented incident in which workers constructing royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, unpaid and increasingly desperate, staged an organized work stoppage to demand the grain rations they had been promised but had not received. This remarkable incident, preserved in surviving administrative papyri, provides a genuinely fascinating window into the practical economic pressures facing Egyptian society during this period, pressures that likely stemmed at least in part from the sustained military expenditure required to defend against the Sea People's threat, compounded by the broader regional economic disruption caused by the collapse of Egypt's traditional trading partners and diplomatic relationships throughout the wider Bronze Age world. The broader trading networks that had connected Egypt to the wider Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, networks that had provided Egypt with access to tin and other resources necessary for bronze production, along with numerous luxury goods and diplomatic relationships that had characterized the more prosperous and more stable earlier periods of the New Kingdom, were significantly disrupted by the broader collapse occurring throughout the region during this same period. Egypt's successful military defense against direct invasion did not insulate it from these broader economic and diplomatic consequences of the late Bronze Age collapse, and the 20th dynasty that followed Ramesses III's reign, despite his own genuine military achievements, would ultimately preside over a period of gradually declining Egyptian central authority and increasing internal political fragmentation, developments that would eventually contribute to the ending of the New Kingdom period itself and the beginning of what historians term Egypt's Third Intermediate Period. This represents a genuinely important historical nuance worth sitting with for a moment. Egypt's military survival against the Sea Peoples, while representing a genuine and historically remarkable achievement, particularly when compared against the fate of so many other Bronze Age kingdoms throughout the wider region, did not somehow exempt Egypt from experiencing its own significant, if less catastrophic, consequences from this same broader period of civilizational disruption. Egypt survived as a continuous civilization in a way that the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace world simply did not, but this survival still came at genuine cost, and the Egypt that emerged from this crisis, while still recognizably continuous with the Egypt that had preceded it, was nonetheless a somewhat diminished power compared to the height of New Kingdom prosperity and international prestige that had characterized earlier reigns, including that of Ramesses II himself. Ramesses III's later reign and his death. Let's spend some time now with the remainder of Ramesses III's reign following his celebrated military victories, because his eventual fate provides one of the more genuinely dramatic and well-documented episodes in the entirety of Egyptian royal history, a story that reveals much about the internal political tensions that existed even within a royal court still celebrating its recent successful defense of the entire kingdom. Ramesses III continued to rule Egypt for approximately 2 decades following his decisive victory over the Sea Peoples, a reign that, despite the genuine military successes we have discussed at length, was increasingly troubled by the kind of internal economic and administrative strain we touched upon in the preceding section, including continued evidence of delayed worker payments and the broader economic pressures affecting Egyptian society during this challenging period. The most dramatic episode of Ramesses III's later reign, and the event that would ultimately end his life, is known to modern historians as the Harem Conspiracy, a genuinely elaborate palace plot involving one of the pharaoh's own secondary wives, a woman named Tai, who conspired together with numerous palace officials and, remarkably, some individuals connected to Egypt's own judiciary and military establishment, in an attempt to assassinate Ramesses III and place her own son on the Egyptian throne instead of the officially designated heir. This conspiracy, and the extensive legal proceedings that followed its discovery, are documented in a remarkable set of surviving papyri, most notably a document known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, which records the trial proceedings against the numerous conspirators, including the specific charges brought against them and the punishments ultimately handed down, punishments that in several cases included the death penalty, and in at least one case involved a punishment that permitted the convicted conspirator to take his own life rather than face formal execution, apparently as a mark of some residual respect for his prior social status despite his conviction for treason. For many decades, Egyptologists debated the precise circumstances of Ramesses III's own death, since the surviving trial documents, while describing the conspiracy and its aftermath in considerable detail, remained somewhat ambiguous regarding whether the assassination attempt against the pharaoh himself had actually succeeded or had been thwarted before it could be carried out. This genuine historical mystery was finally resolved through modern forensic analysis, when a CT scan of Ramesses III's mummy, conducted in 2012, revealed a severe wound to his throat, a wound consistent with a fatal knife attack, and severe enough that modern forensic pathologists concluded it would have caused death very quickly, likely within minutes. This modern scientific analysis, conducted more than 3,000 years after the events themselves, finally confirmed what the ancient trial documents had long suggested but never explicitly stated. The assassination conspiracy against Ramesses III had, in fact, succeeded, and the pharaoh who had successfully defended Egypt against an existential external threat that had destroyed so many other Bronze Age kingdoms was ultimately killed not by any foreign enemy, but through betrayal within his own royal household. There is something genuinely striking, even poignant, about this particular historical juxtaposition. A pharaoh who successfully defended his entire civilization against the same kind of catastrophic collapse that had destroyed the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace world, who is remembered by history precisely for this remarkable defensive achievement, ultimately falling not to the external forces he had so successfully repelled, but to internal political intrigue within his own palace. Reminder that even the most militarily successful ancient rulers remained genuinely vulnerable to the more intimate and more immediate dangers of court politics and personal betrayal. How we know what we know. Let's spend some time now discussing the specific sources and methods that allow modern historians and archaeologists to reconstruct this genuinely complex history, because understanding the nature and the limitations of our evidence helps us appropriately calibrate our confidence in different aspects of the story. The primary source for the Sea People's conflict under Ramesses III remains the extensive inscriptions and accompanying relief carvings preserved at his mortuary temple complex at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile near ancient Thebes. This temple complex represents one of the best preserved royal mortuary temples surviving from the entire New Kingdom period, and its extensive decorative program includes not merely the famous Sea People's battle scenes we have discussed at length, but broader depictions of Ramesses III's various military campaigns, his religious devotions, and numerous other aspects of his reign, providing modern historians with an unusually rich and well-preserved body of contemporary Egyptian royal commemorative material to work from. As with the Kadesh inscriptions of Ramesses II that we examined in our previous exploration of Egyptian military history, historians must approach these Medinet Habu inscriptions with appropriate critical awareness of their fundamentally propagandistic purpose and their inherently one-sided perspective. These are not neutral historical records composed by disinterested observers, but rather carefully crafted royal monuments intended specifically to celebrate and commemorate Ramesses III's achievements for religious and dynastic purposes, and the specific claims made within these inscriptions regarding enemy casualties, the completeness of the Egyptian victory, and the pharaoh's own personal role in directing the battle should be understood within this appropriate interpretive context. That said, and this represents a genuinely important distinction from the more ambiguous situation regarding Kadesh, the broader archaeological and historical evidence available to modern scholars provides considerably stronger independent support for the fundamental claim of a genuine, significant Egyptian victory in this particular conflict. Unlike the Kadesh situation, where surviving Hittite records directly contradicted key elements of the Egyptian triumphant narrative, we simply do not possess any comparable independent textual tradition from the Sea Peoples themselves, for the straightforward reason that this loose coalition of displaced peoples, unlike the sophisticated literate Hittite state, does not appear to have maintained the kind of centralized administrative and diplomatic record-keeping tradition that could have produced comparable surviving documentation of their own perspective on these events. Instead, historians rely on a combination of the Egyptian inscriptional evidence itself, carefully read with appropriate critical awareness of its propagandistic purposes, combined with the broader archaeological evidence from throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world documenting the genuine scale and severity of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, and combined further with the subsequent historical and archaeological evidence from the Levantine coastal region, including the archaeological evidence for Philistine settlement in this region during the period immediately following the events described in the Egyptian sources, evidence that provides meaningful independent corroboration for at least the broad outline of the Sea Peoples phenomenon as described, if not for every specific tactical detail claimed within the Egyptian royal inscriptions themselves. Modern archaeological science has also contributed significantly to our understanding of this period through the kind of forensic analysis we discussed regarding Ramesses III's own mummy, along with broader archaeological excavation throughout the eastern Mediterranean world documenting the physical evidence of destruction, abandonment, and subsequent resettlement that characterizes this genuinely turbulent period of ancient history, providing modern historians with an increasingly detailed, if still genuinely incomplete, picture of exactly how this remarkable civilizational crisis actually unfolded across the wider ancient world. The Sea Peoples in the broader sweep of history. Let's take some time now to consider the Sea Peoples phenomenon within its broader historical context, because understanding how this genuinely mysterious episode fits within the larger sweep of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern history helps illuminate both its genuine historical significance and the reasons why it continues to fascinate and puzzle modern historians and archaeologists more than 3,000 years later. The Late Bronze Age collapse, of which the Sea Peoples phenomenon represents one significant and dramatic component, marks one of the most genuinely significant turning points in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, a transition from the sophisticated, interconnected, palace-centered Bronze Age civilizations we have discussed throughout tonight's story toward the considerably different world of the subsequent Iron Age, characterized by different political structures, different technologies, and, in the case of Greece specifically, several centuries of comparative cultural and economic decline that classical scholars traditionally refer to as the Greek Dark Ages, a period from which Greek civilization would only gradually re-emerge, eventually producing the classical Greek world of Athens and Sparta that we explored in our previous examination of ancient Athenian daily life. Egypt's survival through this crisis, while genuinely remarkable and while it represents a significant historical achievement in its own right, should not obscure the genuine reality that Egypt itself, as we discussed regarding the economic strain and internal political tensions of Ramesses III's later reign, did not emerge from this period entirely unscathed or unchanged. The New Kingdom period itself would ultimately end within roughly a century following Ramesses III's reign, giving way to Egypt's third intermediate period, characterized by fragmented political authority and, eventually, periods of foreign rule that would foreshadow the later conquests by Assyria and Persia that would eventually bring an end to Egypt's long history of independent pharaonic rule entirely. The specific mystery surrounding the Sea Peoples' precise origins and ultimate fate continues to attract genuine scholarly attention and continued research, including ongoing archaeological investigation throughout the eastern Mediterranean world, ongoing linguistic and textual analysis of the surviving ancient sources, and increasingly sophisticated scientific techniques including DNA analysis of ancient human remains from sites associated with Sea Peoples settlement, particularly in the Philistine coastal region of the southern Levant, research that has, in recent years, provided genuinely significant new evidence supporting the broad theory connecting at least the Pele set specifically with populations originating from the Aegean world, lending increased scientific support to theories that had previously rested primarily on more circumstantial archaeological and textual evidence. This ongoing scholarly research reminds us that even historical episodes as seemingly distant and as seemingly thoroughly documented as the Sea Peoples conflict continue to yield new insights as archaeological and scientific methods continue to advance, and that our understanding of even well-known ancient historical episodes remains, appropriately, an ongoing and evolving process rather than a fixed, permanently settled body of established fact. What the Delta remembers. As we bring tonight's story to its close, let's take a moment to reflect on the genuine historical significance of this remarkable episode, and to consider what the successful Egyptian defense against the Sea Peoples ultimately meant, both for Egypt itself and for the broader trajectory of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. The Battle of the Delta represents, in many genuine respects, one of the most consequential military engagements in the entire history of the ancient world, not necessarily because of its scale, which, while significant, was considerably smaller than the massive chariot engagement we examined regarding the Battle of Kadesh, but because of what its outcome actually determined. Whether Egypt, one of humanity's oldest continuous civilizations, would survive the same catastrophic collapse that had already destroyed so many of its Bronze Age contemporaries, or whether it too would join the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean palace world on the long list of vanished Bronze Age kingdoms, their sophisticated cultures reduced to archaeological ruins and fragmentary textual references studied by later scholars attempting to reconstruct what had once existed. Egypt's survival, secured in significant part through Ramesses III's successful military preparations and tactical innovations at the Delta, meant that Egyptian civilization would continue as a recognizable, continuous cultural and political tradition for many subsequent centuries, through periods of both genuine strength and periods of significant weakness and foreign domination, but nonetheless maintaining a degree of cultural continuity that distinguishes Egypt from so many of its Bronze Age contemporaries whose sophisticated civilizations simply ceased to exist during this same turbulent period of history. The mystery of the Sea Peoples themselves, their genuine origins still not fully resolved despite more than a century of dedicated scholarly research, continues to represent one of the most genuinely fascinating open questions in ancient history, a reminder that even significant, well-documented historical events can retain genuine elements of mystery and continued scholarly debate, and that the ancient world, for all that modern archaeology and historical research has revealed about it, continues to hold genuine secrets that patient continued research may yet illuminate more fully in the years and decades to come. The Nile Delta today looks considerably different from the marshy, channel-divided landscape where Ramesses III's forces once fought to determine the survival of their entire civilization. The specific channels and waterways where Egyptian ships once grappled with Sea Peoples vessels have long since shifted and changed, as the Nile's own delta has continued its slow, patient geological evolution across the more than 3,000 years that separate us from these dramatic events. But the temple walls at Medinet Habu still stand, still preserving in carved stone and painted color the Egyptian memory of this remarkable moment when one civilization, alone among so many of its contemporaries, successfully defended itself against a catastrophic wave of destruction that had already consumed so much of the ancient world around it. Ramesses III would ultimately die at the hands of his own palace conspirators rather than any foreign enemy, a genuinely striking historical irony given his celebrated military achievements against external threats. But his successful defense of Egypt against the Sea Peoples ensured that the civilization he had fought so hard to protect would continue, would produce future dynasties and future pharaohs, would eventually face and ultimately succumb to different conquerors in different centuries, but would nonetheless maintain a degree of continuous cultural identity and historical memory that allows us, more than 3,000 years later, to still read the words he had carved into temple walls, still see the images of that decisive battle in the Delta, and still recognize, across this enormous span of time, the genuine historical significance of what was accomplished during those critical years when the entire Bronze Age world seemed to be collapsing around Egypt's ancient and enduring borders. Sleep well. Good night.